Good afternoon, Wrestle Talk Show fans. My name is Joshua Zimmerman, and I am again your host for another edition of Wrestle Talk Show. Today we will be discussing WWE's wellness policy, as well as the recent deaths in wrestling, and kind of going back and forth on what what is being done, what could be done, how it could be broadened, and how it's kind of a you'll find getting right into it, you'll find that it's a generic kind of policy. Uh, it basically, I guess, as any employer would want to or mandated coverage, it covers WWE's end where they test for things once a year, if not better. But what they're quoting as a success has really been the only notable success or only success they bothered to mention. Came 2 months, actually a year and 2 months after the program was initiated. The WWE Wellness Policy was initiated February 2006. I want to say right after Eddie Guerrero's death. Basically, to summarize their wellness program real quick, they start out with what's called baseline testing, and baseline testing, in their own words, basically you can pass or fail on this first baseline test, and with no repercussions. And from the baseline test, it basically gives Dr. Black of the facility in Tennessee, um, kind of gives him grounds on what to expect in future tests, what not to see come next month, etc., etc. I worded it as the free pass because that's literally how it's worded. The first and baseline test would be more used to determine what a wrestler should be on and what a wrestler shouldn't be on. One might argue that the doctor would have previous medical history from other promotions or from the outright general practitioners or specialists of the wrestlers that they're signing, especially ones that they know come with injuries or have had injuries. You figure that they wouldn't have to do this baseline test on everyone. The way I see it is you announce it. I wouldn't say spring it on them, but just to be fair, the baseline test basically does that. But there would be no reason for a baseline test if you just gave them, say, a month's notice back in 2006 or 90 days notice, however you, between those two, 30 days and 90 days, and then from previous medical history of your wrestlers, I think it would be safe to say there would be no need for a baseline test because one, you've given them notice of the testing and how it will be regular testing from here on out, and then you also have the records of all your wrestlers in front of you so you can gauge who should be on something and who shouldn't and what they should be on and what they shouldn't. Like I said, baseline testing basically gives like a starting point, and that uh, determines tests from thereafter. First failed test after that is a 30-day suspension without pay. But when you're, my argument with that is, when you're being signed to the contracts that the superstars are, even your smaller ones, are being signed for more money than they would ever make in the independents. Um, you'd think that, especially if you're a wrestler that knows that they have a workable gimmick, losing 30 days isn't really losing anything at all because in your first couple months before your suspension, whatever the case may be, you've already made enough money to cover that month. I haven't seen anything different, so I'm going to go on what I've read previously. But when this uh, outline and program first came out, they outlined how they were more worried about covering agents, prescription drug use, than steroid use, um, or masking agents rather. But when it comes to drugs like marijuana, they have time off and a fine. It basically says do this drug and we'll get rid of you, but do this drug that we don't find as important or as meaningful, and we're only going to give you some time off and a fine. We hope you learn your lesson. One might argue that even though it's used for treating pain and whatnot, and I have my own views on this drug, you'd think that you wouldn't be able to perform coherently even under the influence of marijuana, let alone your opioid dependencies and other prescription drugs, your benzos and all that stuff. Second positive test leads to another another suspension, this time 60 days without pay. And if Dr. Black sees fit, he could mandate inpatient treatment for that 60 days. And they didn't say it, but it's safe to assume that you would not be able to return to work without doctor approval and proof that you went through the mandated treatment, however long it was emphasized to be. The final test, if you make it this far, at this point, it seems pretty comprehensive what they're looking for. So if you're still doing it, you basically bring this on yourself, and your name's pretty much Carlito. The final positive test, and strike three, fittingly, is automatic termination. They don't want to bother after this point, and who's to say that you blame them? Wrestlers are screened annually for pre-existing and developing cardiovascular issues, as well as they're ordered to go once a year or as warranted stress tests, cardio stress tests, and stress tests in general. I don't know if there's a difference. Forgive me for being a little behind on that. I'd imagine they're one and the same. A stress test in general to see what your body's going through. And like we mentioned in the beginning of the program, this was implemented following Eddie Guerrero's death. It was always in place, but it wasn't really pushed until one of WWE's biggest superstars at the time just dropped dead at 38 years old. So it kind of made them have to enforce what they actually had in writing. It no longer just looked good as documentation. It had to be enforced, and the company had to show that it was enforcing it. Like I said, talent treated in annually for pre-existing and developing cardio issues. The death of Chris Benoit led to the federal investigation of steroid abuse in the professional wrestling industry. One of the first to be looked at, excuse me, as a result of this investigation was Signature Pharmacy, which after their investigation listed several wrestlers, including Kurt Angle and a couple of other fan-friendly names, for lack of better terms right now, that some got mentioned and some got suspended, but obviously the ones that weren't in WWE, you gotta wonder what happened, because as previous podcasts and insider shows have mentioned, TNA has a wellness program too, but TNA, for some reason, is allowed to not detail its wellness policy, whereas WWE has been scrutinized for not disclosing anything. I really don't, not to play sides, and I'm not here, but I really don't think it's fair to do that to one brand and have pretty much the same thing, only on a lower scale based on popularity, but it's the same thing, where you're not scrutinizing it in TNA. It's still professional wrestling, the wrestling industry. It's still a brand. It might not be a popular brand, but there's still major names in there, and why their wellness policy, why it hasn't been asked for full disclosure on that, is kind of beyond me. You shouldn't treat one worse than the other just because WWE is the more favored name. Everything should be disclosed. This way, we know who's on what and who's not on what. The only thing WWE cites as a credit, which is actually kind of funny, the only thing they cite as a credit since implementing the wellness policy is in, like I said, a year and 2 months after the wellness policy was put into effect, they found out that known wrestler to SmackDown, MVP, had a form of, I want to say Parkinson's, but it's actually a syndrome. I could be wrong. It's called Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome, discovered during a routine checkup in August of 2007. And that's only, as far as Wikipedia goes, that's the only major credit they've had since then. Everything else, sadly, has been deaths. And I kind of heard one review show yesterday that kind of brought up a good point. They were discussing this and the recent death, and no, 10 years later, WWE shouldn't be blamed, but it's also, if they die like 10 years after working for the company, they shouldn't be directly blamed, and it shouldn't come back up as these wrestlers have decided within that 10 years, I'd imagine, to work for other promotions or go back to the independent circuit and basically knowingly putting themselves back through the strain that either put them in a medical condition or on routine medications to begin with. After WWE, I think it's, as WWE itself was, it's the performer's choice whether or not he or she continues to go, and whether or not he or she is stabilizing their conditions or have become so used to the medications that they're just performing under these medications. And the argument's always been, how long until WWE can stop being blamed? And we'll get into more of this on part 2, but I just got done saying that you can't blame them for years down the road, but if WWE originates the ailment, shouldn't they have a responsibility to follow the wrestler or cover just the pre-existing injuries? Say if I blew out my back, there should be something in writing that if I go to another promotion and I have a problem with my foot, no, WWE shouldn't handle that. But if WWE was responsible for my care when I blew out my back, and my doctors can prove that this one injury stemmed to a lot of other injuries, then maybe coverage should stay on a partial basis and maintain treatment there, but new ailments and other pre-existing injuries, no. Basically, like I outlined it. But we'll get into more of it in part 2, including whether or not it's enough. Stay tuned.